Good morning, everyone. My name is Ronald Day. I'm Vice President of Programs and Research at the Fortune Society. Very excited about this conversation that we're going to have today. Fortune has been around for 55 years providing services to people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. We do, as John Lewis said, make good trouble on behalf of those who have been incarcerated. I have the privilege today to offer some opening reflections for this particular conversation. I'm very excited about this. First of all, I want to thank all of the folks who made this particular conversation possible. We know how difficult it is to pull off a live stream event, and we're still going through the mechanics of that right now as we speak. But thank you to the National Academies for your partnership. Thank you to Eastern State Penitentiary, and also, of course, thank you to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. We're excited about all of these partnerships. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in to listen and participate in this particular dialogue. We have over 600 people that have registered for the event from 20 different states and including the UK. So again, that is dynamic. And we also want to thank those who are participating in SCI Chester, right? The men who are in that particular correctional facility, and everyone who's here with us live today in Eastern State Penitentiary, as well as those who are live today in our Harlem office at the Fortune Society and the rest of the Fortune offices, and again, everyone else who's joining us for this conversation. So the question, why are we here today? The National Academies released a report called The Limits of Recidivism, Measuring Success After Prison. Several of my colleagues who are here today were on that particular committee. And one of the things that we did was we consulted a myriad of reports to put together this particular document, as well as consulted with dozens of formerly incarcerated individuals who are experts and other experts. But what we didn't get an opportunity to do is to take the conversation into the correctional setting, into the carceral setting, and we think is really, really important for us to do that we include people who are currently incarcerated in these conversations. Now, most of us know and have heard the term recidivism, right? I don't care what space you work in, you know about recidivism, right? We know that it measures reincarcerations, it measures arrests, it measures readjudications, reconvictions, right? We know from one of the last reports that was put out that 1/3 of individuals were rearrested within the first year, 3/5 were rearrested within the third year, and then 71% were rearrested in 5 years. That is telling us about the failure, to a certain extent, that's associated with the system. It's not telling us about any of the success. So we have relatively limited information about what happens with people who actually successfully navigate the pitfalls and the obstacles that are laid bare for them in their transition from prison to the community. And that's what this particular conversation is about. How do we broaden our horizons and not stick to a particular metric, recidivism, that is measuring failure. One other point, and then we're going to turn to the panelists. Right, again, we're talking about what is it that we can learn from individuals who've transitioned and have successfully desisted from crime. I talk about desistance pretty regularly in conversations with people around the country. And they always look at me kind of like glossy, like, what are you talking about? Because so many people, unless you're like an academic, like some of the folks who are here today, have never even heard the term desistance. When I was pursuing my doctorate of talking about desistance, and people who were pursuing doctorates in criminal justice as well had no understanding and no knowledge about desistance. So we're saying that that's at least one of the other topics that we need to involve in this particular conversation. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to the all-star panel that have decided to join us for this particular conversation. I mean, it took a huge effort, not for us to get people to join, but you can just imagine what it takes to get the prominent individuals that we have on this particular panel. And all of them are very humble people, so they're probably like, Ronald, why are you saying that? But this is really true. And you'll see when you read their bios, as well as when you hear what they have to say about this particular topic. So I'm gonna start with my colleague Lauren, who's gonna introduce herself and give you some context about the space that we are holding this particular conversation in. Lauren?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So on behalf of the staff and the board of Eastern State, I want to welcome you all to this space. Raise your hand if it's your first time being in this building. Some people. Okay, great. So you are inside the world's first true penitentiary. We're gathered here in a space that used to be a set of exercise yards. If you look on this side of the room, you can see some doorways. Sorry about that. This would have been where a person would have come from their cell into exercise yards while they lived in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement when Eastern State opened in 1829. Thank you, Dr. Day. It was a radical idea, an idea that was thought to help people achieve penitence, find true regret or true sorrow in their hearts. That system failed, and this room ended up becoming a workshop. If you're in the room with us today, there's some artifacts in the back of the room if you want to take a look. We think this could have been we're not really sure what kind of workshop, but today as a museum, we use this room for conversations like this one. So we could have had this conversation anywhere. Fortune could have hosted this conversation anywhere in a conference room on a college campus. But here at Eastern State, we use the power of place, the power of history to create dialogues, to spark dialogues about criminal justice reform. So we were really, really pleased when Fortune approached us about hosting this event. And I'm the director of education here at Eastern State. And I've been championing our fair chance hiring practices for the past 7 years. I'm really, really pleased to be with you all here today and honored to be invited onto this panel.
Thank you, Lauren. We're going to turn next to Nancy, our colleague from the National Institute of Justice.
Nancy Lavine, I'm director of the National Institute of Justice. I only started in this role in May of this year, so it's a new position for me. The National Institute of Justice is the research and technology arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. What we primarily do is fund research through grants to study a whole host of topics related to crime and justice in this country. Certainly studies of people who have experienced incarceration is an area that NIJ has long invested in. Prior to joining NIJ, I was with the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank and membership association that tries to bridge the divide between left and right in ideology and follow the data and evidence towards solutions and criminal justice reform. And prior to that, I spent 19 years at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., another nonprofit think tank. And it was there that I embarked on several studies of reentry from prison and experiences of people who have navigated that journey. So I have a fair bit to say about the topic today, and I look forward to joining my esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And turn to my right now to Emily.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Day. I just wanted to say, it's just a real honor to be here. It's an honor to be in conversation with the men at Chester, and I'm profoundly grateful for the opportunity to be kind of in conversation with you all. I'm Emily Wong. I'm a professor at the School of Medicine, at the School of Public Health at Yale University. And for the past 15 years, the core of the work that I do is taking care of men and women that have come home from prisons and jails in a Transitions Clinic Network program, where at the center of it, we work alongside experts who've been incarcerated as community health workers that guide the primary care that we do. And over time have built a center at the School of Medicine, in partnership with the Yale Law School, now really focused on what decarceration looks like and how health systems can be at the fore of that conversation of decarceration and really identifying the laws, the policies, and practices that need to be undone or built up to best promote community transformation. So I'm really just excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Deanna?
Hi, I'm Deanna Hoskins, President CEO of Just Leadership USA. Just Leadership is the only national nonprofit founded by and operated by formerly incarcerated individuals. Our mission is to decarcerate the U.S., and we do that through the education, elevation, and empowerment of directly impacted people across the country to actually elevate their voices to actually demand the policy changes that have been marginalizing or oppressing them in their community. Prior to taking over as the President and CEO of Just Leadership, I served as a Senior Policy Advisor for Corrections and Reentry up under the Obama administration with the Department of Justice, overseeing and managing the Second Chance Act. And I always like to say the Second Chance Act was the actual program and opportunity that gave me a chance as I was reintegrating back into society. So it's an honor to be here with you guys today and have a voice at this table. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. And last but certainly not least, Secretary Little.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and be a part of this conversation today. I come before you representing the some 16,000 men or women with the Pennsylvania Department of Correction, but also the roughly 38,000 men and women who are in residence in our state correctional institutions, and about 35,000 who are currently reentering either through parole or alternative programs. I think the main thing for our agency has really been a shift away from looking at recidivism as the sole measure as we think in terms of reentry. 95% of the men and women who come to us here in Pennsylvania are going home one day. And so the real shift has been a focus on success, successful reentry to the community. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that this morning, but just that shift in paradigm and focusing on that from the day that someone arrives with us in residence at one of our state correctional institutions and preparing them every step along the way, giving them opportunities for that chance for change is a fundamental rethinking of how we go about our business. And so as I sit here at Eastern State and think about where we started out here in Pennsylvania and look at where we are today, I'd have to say we've come a mighty long way.
Thank you, Secretary Little. And you can see the diversity of the voices that are here in Pennsylvania. So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn to our colleagues in Fortune's Harlem office to do introductions. Michaela, turning it over to you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today here in Harlem, at Eastern State, and online. I'm Michaela Linder. I'm the Senior Director of Research here at the Fortune Society. We are joining you from our Harlem location, Castle Gardens, which is a mixed-use, supportive, and affordable housing development that opened in 2010. At the Fortune Society, I work at our Center for Research, Inquiry, and Social Justice, which opened in August of 2021. Chris J. works to end mass incarceration, advance equity, and improve the well-being of our communities through research that is innovative, community-based, and action-oriented. I will now turn it over to our two panelists in Harlem. We have Stanley Richards, Fortune's Deputy Chief Executive Officer, and Jeremy Travis, the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. Stanley and Jeremy, can you please introduce yourselves? And as part of your introduction, can you say why the topic today is important to you? Why don't you start, Stanley?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stanley Richards, Deputy CEO of the Fortune Society. I've been doing this work since 1991, since my return from prison. And I dedicated my life to, one, changing the process and the system that chews up so many Black and brown people. And so at Fortune, we do that through our services and we do it through our advocacy, trying to provide pathways for people to rebuild their lives and then changing the system that chews up so many communities. Today's topic is really important because we need to shift our lens and we need to shift the way in which we work, both as a community of providers who are providing the healing post the trauma of incarceration and changing the system that does not see the collateral consequences and damage of mass incarceration. the disproportionate impact on some of the Black and brown communities in our country that go on for generations need to stop, and we need to elevate solutions and change the framework by which we operate. And today's conversation will allow us to chip away at what we know has been generations of institutional isolation and trauma for some of our most disproportionately under-resourced and under-supported communities. So I am thrilled to be here and to be involved in this conversation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Travis. I am the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, which is a national philanthropy dedicated to, among other things, criminal justice reform around the country. I am just really thrilled beyond words to be part of this discussion and honored to be invited. Dr. Day said it was an all-star panel that's been brought together, and looking at the folks who are at Eastern and the people who are here, it is truly an all-star cast. I want to commend the Fortune Society for taking on this topic and for making this a central part of this work, and the National Academies for also putting out a really first-rate report on recidivism. It's so heartening to hear Secretary Little talk about a fundamental rethinking from his point of view of the work of corrections officials, because I think that same phrase applies to what's happening in the country, which is a fundamental rethinking of how we respond to crime and justice, so that we look at these phenomenon as part of a larger complex of our aspirations for multiracial democracy. We can't have a multiracial democracy that's worthy of the name if we incarcerate as many people as we do, if we do the damage we've done to Black and brown communities and marginalized communities, and if we pay so little attention to the humanity of people who are incarcerated and their ultimate journey home and their journey through life. So recidivism has been this just this blockage to our ability to do that rethinking. And my work at Arnold for the past 5 years, my work before that with Nancy and others at the Justice Policy Center at Urban, I was her predecessor at NIJ, where we started the work on reentry and the Second Chance Act, and at the National Academy, where I co-chaired with Bruce Western the panel on high rates of incarceration. All of this comes together in this really interesting ways around this question of recidivism, because what is it that we hope for as a country for people who have been incarcerated? What is the aspiration that we hold for them, that they hold for themselves, their families hold for them? It's not recidivism. So let's just say, let's think about how to move this away from to clear our thinking is a good day for all of us who are dedicated to justice. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. We're so excited to hear more. Right now, we are going to transition to a 10-minute video filmed inside SCI Chester, which is a medium security prison in Chester, Pennsylvania. We will hear in that video from 2 incarcerated individuals, Secretary Little, and members of our Center for Research, Inquiry, and Social Justice. We're really honored and grateful that we were allowed to film this panel inside SCI Chester. Often prisons are a black box of our society where people on the outside aren't able to see what's going on inside the walls. So this is really an exciting opportunity to hear directly from people inside, and we believe that is integral that currently incarcerated individuals are included in these conversations. So we will transition over to that video now.
Hello, I'm Ronald Day, Vice President of Programs and Research at the Fortune Society, and we're here at SCI Chester to have a really important conversation about the limits of recidivism, evaluating success for people after prison, and I have some dynamic colleagues with me. I think we could just start with introductions.
Hello, I'm George Little. I'm Secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Correction.
Hi, my name is Carla Denold. I'm a contract manager at the Fortune Society.
Hello, I'm Valeria. I'm a research assistant at the Fortune Society.
My name is Eric. I'm a Currently incarcerated here at SCI Chester.
My name is Paul, and I'm also currently incarcerated at SCI Chester.
What we want to do here is to have a conversation with currently incarcerated individuals, along with the secretary, about recidivism and about success after release. We felt it was really important to bring this conversation into a correctional setting, because as we worked on the report, The Limits of Recidivism, we talked to a variety of experts, people in academia, people in nonprofits, people, a lot of different spaces doing this work. And we talked to a lot of formerly incarcerated individuals, many of whom are experts themselves, CEOs of nonprofits, they're academics themselves, teaching in universities, some of them just doing, typical work, construction or what have you, but living a productive and meaningful life, wanting to do all they can to make a contribution and to be an example for folks who are coming home from incarceration of how you can be successful. But we also said we need to have the conversation with folks who are currently inside. First to Secretary Little, and just, ask you a question, and that is, what is the Pennsylvania Department of Correction currently doing for people as they prepare for their release that you think is working well and that could actually be expanded?
So I think that what the department is doing now is on the, I guess you could say, hard skill side, is trying to provide educational programs, whether they're academic programs or vocational programs, perhaps other experiences that actually build up skills which are marketable. But on the softer side, and I think just as important, are helping to provide pathways, if you will, whether it's employability related, whether it's mentoring, whether it's family reunification, recognizing that if somebody's coming home, it's more than just the woman or the man who's coming back to the community. It's really about their whole family. And so we're doing that with a particular focus towards the end of a term of incarceration, starting maybe 4 years out, but really amping it up at 2 years, 1 year, 6 months. What the vision is, though, that we can begin to prepare individuals by charting out a clear path the day that they arrive with us, knowing that 95% of the men and women who come to the Pennsylvania Department of Correction one day are going to go home. And so for everyone, we know we've got to meet them where they are. So one size is not going to fit all.
I appreciate that notion that reentry starts from when we enter, because some places the focus is you have 6 months to your release, or you have 3 months to your release, or you have 1 month to your release, and it's do all this preparation. But if we can have people thinking about their release from the time that they enter the facilities, we're going to be in a much better position. So what do you, Secretary Little, think are some of the resources that the department could use, not just the department here, but we could use in general to help individuals prepare for their release, in addition to some of the things that you just mentioned? What new resources do you actually need?
I think one of the big changes that I've seen over my career, and in terms of resources that are needed, is understanding that it's about partnerships. It's not something that corrections can do ourselves, parole or the institutions. We really got to partner with the community and not be afraid to reach across the fence or have people reach inside the fence. And so much of life is about relationships that are established. So maybe it's that support network that helps somebody to be successful. It is jobs, it is education, it is getting back with your family, right? So I think the biggest thing is establishing those partnerships. And I'll just take one real quick example, and that's with businesses. A lot of businesses are leery about giving someone a second chance or a third chance, and they think there's too much risk involved. And so I think if we can dispel the myths, and if we can really build up those relationships, because one of the two things that are big determinants is being able to have a livable wage, right, where you can support yourself, where you can take care of your family and your family obligations. It may not be day one, but you can see a path. And the other is housing, is you got a safe place to live, because if you go back to the same people, places, and things that you left, my experience, I'm just talking about in my life, is you go back to doing the same things that you've always done. So I think having those partnerships that help to deal with those two tangible issues, if you think about the needs, the hierarchy of needs, that's where we can use more help. But that's really on the outside more so than it is even on the inside.
Yeah, thank you for that. As someone who served 15 years in prison myself and then 5 years on parole, I think it's extremely important the in-reach, bringing in individuals, allowing organizations to come into the facilities and to do exactly what you said, to offer the hard skills, to offer the soft skills, to help individuals prepare for their transition to the community. Carla?
Absolutely. I'd love to ask Paul a question and just find out, what does success mean to you when you think about your journey ahead?
Is exactly what Secretary Little just said as far as serving any amount of time, 15 years, 2 years, whatever. Things change over time, long time, short time. So house, if not house, safe apartment, things like that. Trying to patch together those unhealthy relationships that occurred during your incarceration. As sad as it is, things don't really remain good with a lot of family members throughout incarceration, bitterness, resentment, things like that. Employment that you're not going to be, worrying and stressed out about paying whatever bills it is that you have. The employment that we do have in here, we go about that employment a certain type of way to maintain a certain type of work discipline. So when you do go home, I know people that get up 5 in the morning and, a lot of us, you can't come out your cell that early, but you're getting in a routine of, this is what I have to do. This might be the type of thing I have to do. And they go throughout their day running and running and running just to stay in a work ethic mentally. So whether it's 1 or 2 sustainable, employment to keep you afloat, to whatever it is, you deem the level that you want to live. The way people live is different. What might satisfy one person might not satisfy the next person. So that's what I think. But personally, that's what I want. That's what I want.
And I wanted to ask a question to Eric. What are you currently doing to prepare yourself for success while you are, inside? And what is working well for you, and maybe what additional support do you need?
Now I try to stay busy, and it's just, even now sitting here, it just kind of amazes me of the things that I've been able to do, and just sometimes, just by accident, I would say, but I've gained my barber's license, my barber manager's license, but my greatest achievements was my GED. It was just something about getting my GED that just kind of told me that I could do anything. The sky was the limit. A little bit of acting, just so much stuff, man. I found myself in, coming upstate. To be honest, I was a little scared, And I found myself one day on a basketball court, in the penitentiary, officiating. And this, if you know anything about, prison.
That's a tough job, officiating.
Exactly. And one day I'm already out there and I'm just like, I cannot believe I'm out here doing this, right? We were able to do small skits and bring some laughter and joy to the men, and found out that I like acting, you know what I'm saying? So things like that. Just, like I said, just so much, man, that I just try to stay busy. And just really from day one, I've been trying to prepare to go home, because the way I was living before I came in is not an option for me to go back, so a lot of self-reflecting, what are my plan A, B's, and C's, am I comfortable within myself if I have to go to a shelter? Being successful, for me is just to take those regrets that I learned to have, and just try to turn them around, and I regret leaving my kids, but I have a chance to go back out there and still be a father.
So I'm going to turn a question to Secretary Little, since we had an opportunity to engage with individuals at that particular conversation in SCI Chester. And for this particular audience, just wanted to know, what would you like to share about the takeaway from that particular conversation for this audience here?
For me, one of the biggest takeaways is simply engaging with the men and women who we have in our care and custody. Because if you don't have a seat at the table, then as a mentor of mine has put it, you're on the menu, right? So it's one thing for those of us who are professionals, who may be the academicians, to talk about what ought to be done. But it really is about engaging with the men and women, their families, their loved ones, about what needs to be done, because we could do great things, but if they don't meet the needs of those individuals, then we've done nothing.
Thank you. So Emily, for you, why is it important for us to understand how social and structural conditions can support successful release?
Yeah, I'm struck by some of what Eric was talking about and kind of how he envisions success following release. And for me, I think about a lot of the patients that I've seen over the years where many folks come home with many of the hopes and dreams that he's articulating, kind of attending to the regrets that they had, trying to get back with their family. And, they're seeing me in clinics. We're also talking about their high blood pressure, treating hepatitis C, a myriad of issues. And it's about kind of the whole person. And when you start getting into those conversations about the whole persons, then you see that even people with the biggest of hopes, with the clearest of ambitions of trying to attend to those hopes, come up with barriers over and over again. It's barriers coming into the health system where they don't have an ID, they don't have their Medicaid, they don't have that enacted. It's barriers getting a job. We're talking about kind of all the work that this man's prepped to do. Talking about a barber license, right? Well, what if there's a law in your community that prevents you from getting that barber license? How is he going to kind of be well, kind of be his best self coming home, getting back with his family? And so I think a lot of the report and a lot of the conversations that I'm excited about are pushing forward conversations that move beyond an individual level measures. Like, what does this man or woman have to do? How do they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And how do we hold our health systems, our institutions, our communities more accountable to these structures?
Thank you, Emily. And Lauren, a question for you. What have you learned about success in your working with individuals who are currently and formerly incarcerated?
My main takeaways are that success looks really different for every single person. There's no one definition, there's no one pathway, and that pathway is definitely not linear at all. It's really important to let the person define success for themselves. So what is it that they want to do, want to be in the world, right? And to make that success happen, it has to come from within that person. Outside influences can't necessarily change that. It really has to come from the individual, and they have to define it for themselves. And I think that we need to create spaces, as employers, where people can share that definition with you, so you can help them achieve that success.
Thank you, Lauren. And Deanna, how can we promote leadership among justice-impacted individuals, and why is that important?
So thank you for that question. I think, as Lauren said, the leadership actually comes from centering the person's voice to let them lead what success is for them. But also, we can't continue to have this conversation as the individuals are the problem without paying attention to the system. And part of the problem that we run against, I can have all the dreams, hopes, and goals. The department can prepare me, but once I step outside that institution, if society is not welcoming, if there are laws and policies on place that continue to prevent me, my success is going to hit those barriers. As Eric was talking about getting his barber license, it took me back to when I worked in the state of Indiana. And we actually taught barbering inside the Department of Corrections. But the state barbering board had a barrier that if you had a felony conviction, you couldn't get your license. So I'm like, why are we teaching it in a penal institution where everyone has a felony conviction, knowing the person is not going to go any further once they're released? So it's understanding, as Secretary Little said, we've been operating in a silo around corrections. What is corrections doing to prepare people? But out partnering with the community policymakers and different things to ensure that the ability to be successful is there. Ronald, you said something at the beginning that I wanted to go back to that I think we don't pay attention to. When I worked at the Department of Justice, and I managed the Second Chance portfolio, I always asked, what is the definition of recidivism? There is no consistent definition of what equals recidivism in this country, so the numbers we get, we already know is skewed. But if we just take that 35% of people are returning to prison, why I struggle with why we harp on that when that means 65% of us didn't go back to prison, but we ain't paying attention to the 65 that could possibly help the 35. We keep looking at the 35% as if something is wrong with them. Again, not looking at how the system or society has impacted that transition to being successful. If we're actually going to get out of this mud that we're in, we have to center the voices of directly impacted people. When you go to a hospital, the doctor doesn't come out and treat you first. The doctor asks you what is wrong and how can I help you. They allow you to demonstrate what is going on and what your needs are at that time and then evaluate. And we have to change that mode of how we actually approach people who have been impacted by the system if we're going to lead our way out of this mass incarceration.
Thank you, Deanna. And I want to turn the question now to Nancy. Being a prominent academic and now head of NIJ, what do you believe is necessary to ensure the successful development of holistic measures of success?
Thank you for that. What I think needs to happen is that we have to transform the research process as we know it. If you look at academic research, academics are rewarded by publishing a lot in academic journals designed for other academics to read. Because they're rewarded for publishing a lot, they seek easy ways to explore research questions, and those easy ways are by grabbing a hold of a data set that's easily accessible. And in the case of looking at recidivism, it's, I can get arrest data, I can get return to prison data, and I can ask a question of the data, and here's the answer. At NIJ, what I'm prioritizing and promoting is what I'm calling inclusive research. And we want to support inclusive research in as many of our grants as possible. Now, what I mean by inclusive research is research that takes the time to hear from the people who are closest to the issue or problem under study. And that includes every person who's close, right? It's certainly correctional staff, it's the educators in prison settings, but absolutely it's the people who are experiencing incarceration and experiencing that process of preparing for release and that pathway towards success in the community. And in order to do that, I'm not saying that we shouldn't support research that is quantitative in nature, because there's a lot of good that comes from understanding numbers. Numbers represent themes, right, in the aggregate, but that you combine the numbers with the narratives so you really understand what those numbers are saying. I think it will humanize research, and it will make for better research that's more impactful and leads to real relevant policy changes that are more likely to be successful because they're grounded in the truth of the people who are experiencing these issues.
Excellent. And it's wonderful to hear that from the director of NIJ, and having you be a part of this particular conversation about moving away from, no one is saying giving up completely, focusing on recidivism, but that we have to expand the tent to use other metrics and to include other individuals in the conversation. So thank you for that. Turn back to you, Secretary Little. So staff working in carceral settings rarely have opportunities to see examples of success among formerly incarcerated individuals. How might it benefit DOC staff if they had access to stories? And I say that because I'm on a committee, and I remember one of the commissioners saying, the only time that I get an opportunity to see people is when they come back to prison.
From a staff standpoint, I think it's important to really see the why. Why are we doing this work? And so when you hear the stories, I think that adds to the why. One experience for me is meeting with a man who had done time with me when I was a warden, but I met him in a church. I heard somebody walking up from behind me. Now, of course, having worked In a prison setting, I hear footsteps behind me, I immediately respond. And when I turned, I saw him, and I greeted him by name, and I saw this broad smile, and he called me Warden Little, and I said, no, you're out now, I'm George. Now, for me, that speaks to the why. That was a success. And success is not absolute. It's not an either or. I mean, if we think about life changes, none of us are perfect in this world. And so it's really about the amount of time between the hurdles that we encounter. We talked about people of color, and we're coming out of communities of crisis, individuals who have been affected by trauma. And so I think for staff to have a context for the work that we do, understanding, for instance, the impact of trauma, the why, to know that each of us as individuals have different hurdles that we have to clear of different heights. I think that allows us to be more effective, whether you're a correction officer working right there on the front line on the unit, or a parole agent, a healthcare practitioner. It's each of us having that understanding and that context for the work that we do.
Thank you for that. I mean, unfortunately, we say the crime is what you did is not who you are. So that's really important. And that no one wants to be judged into perpetuity for the worst decision that they've ever made. But that is sometimes how society, as Deanna's saying, does it. You know, we say we're a country that believes in second chances, but we have to actually demonstrate that through our actions and through our policies. So I want to turn to Emily now. What do you think physicians should know about justice-impacted individuals, and what should they, or how should they design their practice to better serve individuals who are in reentry?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that strikes me often, and it's, you know, Commissioner Little, you were saying this, is that it's important to kind of really start opening the doors behind bars and to kind of have more transparency around the care that's delivered for the millions of individuals that pass through our jails and prisons. You know, I think people would be shocked to hear this, but medical students, residents, physicians are almost, you know, never get trained that there's a whole healthcare system behind bars. It's constitutionally guaranteed, it exists, and it's largely overseen by correctional leaders and staff. And this kind of disconnect that there millions of people can move in and out of a prison and jail back into the community health system and then back in again, you know, at rates of 35% or 65% within years, is kind of mind-blowing, right? That you would move from these health systems. So that's the first and foremost, that there exists a healthcare system behind bars. And then secondly, that this healthcare system largely operates entirely differently than how our community healthcare system is. There's studies that have shown that kind of adherence is 100%. If you have HIV, for instance, you typically do get your HIV medications. If you have diabetes, you typically do get your insulin. But it's mandated. Adherence is almost 100%. You never learn how to manage your health condition. Sometimes you can be penalized for not getting your health care. And there's a significant amount of distrust that exists in a healthcare system that's operating that way. When you have to pay a $3 copay to see a doctor, and a $3 copay is, you know, 4 days worth of work, you start seeing how the system isn't designed to actually meet the healthcare needs of those that are incarcerated. And this, again, physicians, students, residents don't know. And so when they have a new patient that comes home to the community, as they always do, there's trust, there's concerns, they just don't know how to use the healthcare system, then of course the system needs to be created and fashioned in a way that's more embracing, that's more engaging, so that we can attend to the high risks of hospitalizations, the high risks of deaths immediately, days, weeks, months post-release. And so to me, a lot of the conversation in the health systems now is like looking out of the hospital into the community of population health. How do we ensure the wellness of our community? And to me, this is front and center, that if health systems aren't attending to mass incarceration, aren't attending to justice-involved populations that are coming home, by opening their doors, making it more accessible, people getting access immediately, even without your ID or with your prison ID. That's got to count, right? These are the sorts of things to make health systems more equitable. And so few health systems, though many more, are now starting to talk through how it is that we create these transitions more smoothly and equitably for people that move in and out of prisons and jails.
Thank you, Emily. Well said by a person who was just announced as a MacArthur's Genius Fellow. So congratulations. So question for Lauren. What, is the role of employers in this continuum reentry? I mean, you're an employer, hire people on a regular basis, have programs for the particular population. How is it that employers can support the success of individuals in this continuum?
Well, I think I just heard some things that I feel apply to employers too, right? Like, I meet a lot of other employers that want to know about our fair chance practices, and they're afraid of the risk. They don't understand. They've never been inside a prison. They've never listened closely to people who are formerly incarcerated. And so I think a lot of the things that Emily's talking about with healthcare, we can apply, straight to employers too. We play a really critical role because people need jobs to buy food, to get paid, to have housing, to support their families. I think that we can really contribute to this holistic vision of post-release success by recognizing that not everybody's lived experience is the same. We have to create workplaces where people can show up as their fullest selves without this stigma of being a returning citizen and that stigma of incarceration. We need to also provide employment opportunities where people can rebuild their confidence. I've heard that so much from folks who have come to work at Eastern State, that not only could they show up knowing that their employer truly embraced fair chance hiring practices, they could be their fullest self here, but also that they were receiving training in a field that they had never, ever considered. And I would say museums and historic preservation have not been welcoming for returning citizens historically, have not been welcoming for people of color historically. And so museums and historic preservation, the fields that I work in specifically, really need to work extra hard to build those relationships and be welcoming. I think that employers need to be knowledgeable of the challenges of reentry. They need to be knowledgeable about trauma, what Secretary Little spoke to a little bit earlier, right? I had somebody recently who I was working close with talk about how the trauma of reentry was more intense than the trauma of incarceration, which was really eye-opening to me. We also need to make sure as employers that we have people with lived experience in prison in all parts of the organization. I can tell you right now, Eastern State, in order to do its best work, we have to have formerly incarcerated people in our leadership so that they can mentor other folks who are coming in to work in this environment with that lived experience too. You just can't do any better than somebody who's walked the path that you are currently on, so that, we can, again, have people with lived experience shaping all of our programming at Eastern State, but also so somebody has a person they can go to who's really been there. And then the logistics of reentry, I think, are really important for employers to understand. So understanding criminal background checks and the regulations that are operating within the field and the business that they're in, how to be creative in working in and around those policies, but also how to interface with the parole officer or probation officer, because sometimes we have to have those conversations and help people get to where they need to be so that they can be able to come to work the next day. Similarly, how to help new employees get state IDs, which is a really critical part of coming on board onto payroll in an organization. So those are just some of the things that occur to me.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I want to turn back to Deanna now, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this particular question. I know the work that you do is extremely broad and vast, but I do want to ask about what does success look like for formerly incarcerated women of color, and how can we better support them following their transition from prison to the community?
Thank you for that. I think one of the things we have to focus on is, as Secretary Little said, we can't have a cookie cutter approach, right? Typically, women are mothers. We left children behind. We're spouses. We're aunties. We're supporting other people who have been incarcerated. And traditionally, women are incarcerated based on relationships, who they were involved with and connected to, what they've experienced in life. And we had never really created gender-based interventions around trauma and actually helping people heal. And one of the things that we're starting to see is this real focus on women being released back into the community. But again, it starts behind the wall, right? If I'm not addressing the trauma, and I think sometimes we forget, trauma may have gotten me there, but incarceration is traumatic within itself as well. So if you're not addressing my trauma, then you're releasing me back to the community saying, go be successful, but you never even addressed it why I got here, right? You never even addressed what took place while I was inside the correctional facility. So really paying attention to that. I think one of the underrepresented populations are women. And let's be honest, penal institutions at one time was mostly staffed by men. So you created women institutions that were staffed by men, and the abuse that we may have experienced prior to getting there continued on as well. So the level of accountability, even for that harm that has been caused, has to be paid attention to. But I also think, again, you know, in this country, we say children of incarcerated parents have a higher rate of being incarcerated. When I was removed from my children, the focus was on punishing me for the crime that I did. Nobody paid attention to my children who were now in foster care, who were now acting out in school, right? In urban communities, we have more police officers than we do social workers in our school. So when my son started acting out, he was sent to juvenile hall versus someone sitting down saying, this child has been removed from his mother. He's now in foster care. What are we saying as a system to the population or the individuals left behind, realizing that we don't incarcerate people, we incarcerate families, and that the family as a unit needs to be treated if we're actually going to be successful.
Thank you so much for that answer. I want to turn back to Nancy and ask you a question about potential data sources. So what potential data sources can be used to measure success post-release? Again, we focus on recidivism, but we want to widen the tent.
Yeah, thanks for that. We haven't really spoken a lot about different metrics of success. I mean, we talked a little bit about employment and housing, and we touched upon health, primarily behind bars. But those are all very important metrics. I'm going to bring you back, at the risk of being a broken record, to this notion of inclusive research, though, because I think some of the most important measures come from the people who are experiencing that process, who know best how they're doing. And some of them are hard to measure with existing data. You know, like I was saying before, there's no administrative data set on how one is navigating reuniting with family members, right? You need to hear from them how that's going. And I think, you know, the reason we don't do this is because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money, frankly. But this is not an area where we should cut corners. To the contrary, I think we need to really prioritize this.
Thank you. And we're going to turn back to our colleagues in Harlem in a second to get some reflections from Jeremy and from Stan. But what I want to do is just tell a quick story about why this matters. We had a staff person working with us who was in our housing division, and he was doing very well after his release from incarceration. He's working for Fortune. He has a good job with benefits, etc. And he's on parole supervision. And what ended up happening was he ended up doing something he wasn't supposed to do, running a stop sign, and he gets pulled over. And when he was pulled over, discovered that he was on parole, and he ended up, because of a technical parole violation, ended up going back inside for 90 days and was at risk of losing his job and losing his housing. And that's one of the things that we talk about. It's like he was doing very well in his transition, but that particular impediment ended up potentially taking him back. Now, he was in a position where he was working for Fortune, so that didn't happen, but imagine the thousands of other people who have experiences similar, they don't have that particular benefit, all right? And looking at recidivism exclusively, so it's like, oh, well, this person didn't go back. But just because a person didn't go back inside, it doesn't mean that the individual is necessarily successful. And we talked about in a report about expanding the definition of success and looking at overall well-being. Because if someone is homeless or if someone is out of work consistently and struggling, we need to really be thinking about, as you were saying a little while ago, Deanna, trying to help solve some of those issues. All right. So with that, I want to turn it to Michaela so that we can get some reflections again from Jeremy and from Stan. Thank you.
Metrics is a separate challenge. You don't measure one's life, right, that way. You don't have a sort of administrative data set, as Nancy said, that says, oh, I'm leading a good life, right? But that's what we're talking about. So it's a flip of mindset. The metrics that can support that, they're not standalone metrics, are things like healthcare. I think what Emily is doing is just phenomenal. So there's a reason she got the MacArthur Genius Award. It's groundbreaking because it takes the healthcare metrics, but also the healthcare ethos of, first of all, do no harm, and puts it into practice. We can think about that in educational institutions. We can think about that same way of thinking about workforce engagement. We can think about that in terms of family reunification. There's no single metric. That's the problem with recidivism. It's a lousy metric, but it's a single metric. But it's a way of thinking about the life course of people coming out of prison and saying, we are going to help people realize their hopes and dreams. We recognize that all of us face challenges. We're not going to penalize people for those. If someone commits a new crime, that's a separate question for the criminal justice system. It's not a question of punishing that failure even more so. So we will always have and should always think about the public safety consequences of people who get re-engaged in criminal activity. But all of that is a separate enterprise from thinking about how people should lead their lives and how to help them be successful.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So Stanley, can you talk about, from your perspective, the type of programs and interventions that you believe would be helpful within prisons, jails, and during community supervision to kind of help us with this shift to more holistic approaches to reentry?
Yeah, first I would challenge us as a country to rethink the way we think about prisons. I was part of the end solitary confinement work group and closing Rikers, and we did a tour to the Norwegian prisons. And what we've seen was a fundamental shift in the way they thought about incarceration. And they thought about it in a couple of ways. One is that the removal from your community is your punishment, not the conditions of confinement, right? And so they put a lot of work into ensuring the conditions would be as normal as possible, so that when people returned, they returned whole. They returned back to their community ready to re-engage. Two, they thought it was their fundamental responsibility to make sure that anybody who was incarcerated in the prison was left that prison with the resources and skills they needed so they didn't come back. And so they had a whole shift in the way they thought about incarceration and programs, about the correction officers. The correction officers do 2 years of training. They come into the work, their job descriptions read like social work job descriptions. They don't call them correction officers, they call them contact officers, because their job is to maintain contact, develop relationships with people who are incarcerated. And so it's a whole framework. And I think that could be a place where we could start as a country to rethink about incarceration for those who have to go away. What are we really saying? Right now in this country, it's all about punishment. It's about punishment while you're in, and it's about punishment when you come out, collateral consequences. The other thing we need to think about is this whole notion of desistance is, what is it that people need to be their whole selves? And there's no one answer for it. People need different things. And so how do we create a system that allows people to be their whole selves, right? That when they come back into society, that they have access to the resources they need to build new lives. We know it's about jobs, it's about economics, it's about trauma, it's about behavioral health, it's about housing. Those are key aspects of what it takes for people to rebuild their lives. And so as a country, we need to make sure that we're doing the investments in those kinds of things to change the trajectory of so many people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. Right now, we just have a system that is bent on punishment. and then it has the collateral consequences of families and communities, and we need to shift it.
Thank you so much. So, Jeremy, you have written extensively about barriers to reentry, among many other things. Can you talk about, from this report put out by NASEM, what did you find particularly compelling or new or hopeful in terms of where we go from here?
First, let's talk about the process that resulted in the report, which in itself is noteworthy and hopeful. The National Academy is National Academy of Sciences, established by Abraham Lincoln. It's been around for all of that time. It's the nation's voice for science and research. And in this, conducting the panel, the consensus panel that resulted in this report, what's noteworthy that Ronald Day mentioned at the outset is that process included direct conversations between the members of the panel and people with justice involvement. That was a breakthrough for the National Academy of Sciences, and it reflects this shift that's been alluded to by Nancy, by Emily, by Ronald, and others in the policy community, the academic community, to say it's important to have those voices at the table. Secretary Little said that as well. So the process that resulted in the report meant that the report itself is different from what the report would have been without that process, because those voices were included. That's the point. It's not just a fig leaf or just a sort of a nice to have. It's essential to those policy conversations and the research enterprise itself. So for the report to highlight that and to make that as a recommendation is itself, I think noteworthy. And then, if you look at the report as a researcher, you'll see embedded in it, central to it, is a deep critique of the metric of recidivism itself. All the ways in which it's misleading, all the ways in which. So just think about it. Recidivism is usually, did you do something over 3 years after prison or after program participation that resulted in typically an arrest? Doesn't matter when you did it. Doesn't matter how serious it was. It doesn't matter if there's more than one. It doesn't matter if it was on the last day before you got off parole. You are a recidivist. That label gets attached to people because of this measure. So it's very damaging in so many ways. So the fact that there's now from the National Academy of Sciences for students, for professors, for people who want to think about these issues, and for policymakers, this deep critique of the ways in which this particular metric has been misused and is, because it's all about failure, not success, is itself causes harm. So that, from the National Academy of Sciences, I think is a big deal.
Thank you so much. What I find really compelling about what the two of you have spoken about so far is Stanley speaking about how isolation and punishment are, kind of the key pillars of our current criminal legal system. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're seeing here in this conversation and, what you're speaking about, Jeremy, is what's our responsibility as researchers, as policymakers, and also service providers of how do we, through our work, counter that isolation. So no longer excluding people who have justice system involvement from the research process. Or here at Fortune, hiring people at all levels of our organization who have a history of justice system involvement. And I think what this is hopefully showing our audience that no matter where you are, we can help break down the isolation that has been imposed by our criminal legal system. And that's all of our responsibility, to invest in people's success. So my, next question is for both of you, and it is, how does the discussion here today link to larger efforts to end mass incarceration?
Yeah, I think this conversation is a watershed moment, I think, as Jeremy was just saying, with the National Academy of Science. This is a watershed moment for us as a country. We have made some changes in the way the criminal justice system is operating right now. And we've seen some impact and we've seen some progress, but we have a lot more to go. And I just want to tap New York State, for instance. When I was incarcerated on Rikers Island, there was about 21,000 people incarcerated in our New York City jails. Today, while the numbers are going up, unfortunately, today we have 5,900. In New York State, there was 72,000 people incarcerated in our New York State prisons. Today, we have a little over 30,000. We are closing 12 prisons in New York State. And so I just want to say that because I think it's important. I talk about hope a lot because I think hope is at the center of what connects all of us. And Jeremy talked about the humanity that what we all want in life. And so we have made some progress, but today's conversation about shifting our lens and shifting our thinking around recidivism and about reentry and prisons is a critical moment for us to both take stock of where we've been, but to chart a new course where we can go. And it's going to take all of us. It's going to take policymakers. It's going to take researchers. It's going to take community members. It's going to take justice-impacted people. It's going to take service providers to all be leaning in the same place. But here's where I think our challenge lies. We have to see the humanity in everybody. And right now, our system is set up that there has to be winners and losers. Victims, and I don't like using this, victims and perpetrators. And we have to shift that because hurt people. And we have to begin to see the best in each other, even when we make mistakes, even when we're not at our best. We have to believe in the best of each other. And so this conversation today is shifting from what Deanna said, focusing on the 35% who go back, and really lifting up the 65%. And what has happened? What have we done that has allowed that to happen, to support that to happen? And how do we do more of it? And that's the moment we're in right now.
So you've asked a big question, and very few minutes to answer it, or to add anything to what Stanley said. But if we were to, the National Academy has released 3 reports over the past 8 years on this topic, and in reverse order, they tell a big story. The one that just came out a month ago on racial inequality and the justice system in America tells a big story of the history of this country, and particularly the history of white supremacy in this country, and how this has infected the way we think about justice, the way we think about the response to crime, in ways that we are still paying the price. We will pay that price a long time, but we have a lot of work to do on that history. And so I commend that to anybody to read. Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Bruce Weston were the co-chairs. No surprise, it is brilliant. Then we have another report of the National Academy on how did we get here in terms of high rates of incarceration. How have we, as our democracy, quadrupled the per capita rate of incarceration in this country to the point where the damage done, particularly for young men of color who have dropped out of school, can only be called horrific. How have we done that? You can talk about how we did it, why we did it. That's a deeper story about our country and particularly our history with issues of race. And then we have this report, which says, look at the way this has played out in the lives of individual people and programs and policies that stand in the way of success. So all of the collateral consequences mean that we don't trust people to find their way, right? So we've all the barriers we establish. They come down to this sort of mental rigidity of not believing in people and their potential, while at the same time, of course, we have to be wary of what harm people can do to others. But let's flip it. Let's say there is hope. Let's live with the hope, support the hope, with our mind on the possibility that's not going to work, but give second chance, third chance, fourth chance, because that's what we do for each other as humans. That's what families do for each other. So we need to ramp that up to a social policy that we support each other.
Well, thank you so much. So we'll now turn it over again to our community inside SCI Chester.
How can we better assess if individuals are ready for release and can realize success upon release?
We need to get beyond what our impressions are and a subjective approach, if you will. So what we've done is gone so far as to really revamp how we not only assess risk, but more importantly, the needs of the individual, and do that based on data that makes sense here in Pennsylvania. We just really kicked off a new risk needs assessment instrument. One of the things we really struggle with that, because let's just speak to one of the elephants in the room. We have an overrepresentation of men of color, particularly women of color as well. And we recognize that even the tools that we use had bias built into them inherently. And so we spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money, frankly, to pull as much of that bias out as possible. So for us, it's coming up with a prescription that meets the individual. So that's the second piece, not just the data as a whole, but figuring out how we can meet people exactly where that individual is. Paul's not the same as Eric, vice versa. So what may work for you, won't work for me. So each person, we've got to work with them. And then the other thing is to really tap in, so getting beyond the data, to the individual's hopes and aspirations, right? Because you've got to want it. Talk about getting up at 5 in the morning, talking about finding yourself out there officiating. Each of us has a different thing that gets us going each and every day. And so it's finding that. So it's working down from the top down in terms of what can we do as a department, but also creating those opportunities for each individual to be the best person that they can be. And we're going to get there at different times.
As you prepare for your release, what are your thoughts about us utilizing recidivism as kind of like the only metric? If you are thinking, when I get out there, I want to be successful.
I thought about this, about the limitations of recidivism, and it was kind of hard for me to not look at it like that, because I guess just, over time growing up and, I've been conditioned to think that way. Right. So it should be viewed as one of the systems as far as does the individual come back for fewer crimes? Do they come back for, less serious crimes and things of that nature? From a personal level, if I go home for 5 years from now and I get pulled over or whatever the situation is, and I come back to jail, it's hard for me not to think that I messed up some type of way.
Yeah, that you're a failure.
Yeah, it's like completely out there for me not to grasp and say, I must have did something wrong. On the level of success and moving away from that limitation, it's hard. So I don't know that answer.
I'm looking at it as like you said, the 62%. I'm looking at that 38% as just being kind of ignored, and you yourself are part of that 38%. Celebrate these men, because maybe it'd be easier for men to start now, getting these jobs and things like that. So I just think that we just need to talk more about the 38%. I think that 38% their voices need to be heard more, I think it talked about it like, and I rephrase it as peer navigators, men like yourself who catch us when we're coming out, and you can help us navigate through the struggles that you've already been through. And I'm hoping that more of us could be like you and just, I'm right here, and I'm willing to help, That's my thoughts.
What do you think we could do differently, right, to support people better? Something maybe you learn new from the report, or anything that stand out, or just your thoughts?
So I think that you just touched on something, and you as well. One, we need to focus on success, not failure, right? I think a lot of life begins with, if you orient yourself towards success or failure. So if you're worried about failing, right, you're already kind of behind in my mind. So you mentioned technical violations, right? For the first time, this is kind of sad in a way to say this, but for the first time, we're well over 50% of the men and women who are on parole successfully complete here in Pennsylvania. And part of that, we had to change our own culture and mindset to focus on success. I think the other part of it is understanding that life isn't either or. So if you think of substance abuse, which a number of the men and women who are resident in our facilities have struggled with, frankly, a lot of us in the world struggle with. When you think about relapse, you think about people who maybe get that 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, or whatever the interval is for sobriety. I mean, very few people, I use the example of cigarette smokers, just quit, and that was it, never picked up again. So we have to think of it in terms of the length of time, whether we're talking about sobriety, literally. Look at the number of individuals who have mental health issues, the length of time between crises, the length of time in holding a job. And so I think focusing on success and understanding that it isn't an either-or game, that just because you came back, I mean, one of the things we struggled with on our risk needs was, were we going to use arrests or convictions to determine risks? And as we looked around the room, those of us who are African-American males asked the question, how many times did you just get stopped because walking or driving, right? And if you've already become criminal justice involved and the police see you, you're more likely to get stopped. So you get that arrest. If that's your metric for recidivism, the numbers are going to be higher. Now, convictions, go back to your example. And so we chose to use convictions for that very reason. It's harder to get the data, but we think that, you know, the likelihood of it being arrested is greater, and certainly in certain quarters. So I think it's changing the orientation of what we're looking at to success.
Why do you believe it's important that voices of incarcerated individuals are included in conversations such as these to assist in shaping policy and research as we move forward?
I mean, I just think it comes from a place of pain, thought, sincerity, experience. I look at it. I look at it like, you know, you get arrested. You know, you go through the court situation, then you come and you do the time, and then now you're planning on the reentry. You know, we've been through all of that. You know, so it's just like it blows your mind. I really don't know how to answer that. I really don't. I don't. I do want to say this. I do definitely believe that it's vital that we do speak up, you know, and that y'all do take our input, and that we do speak about our experiences about these, you know, reentry and things like that. It's very, very important. I do want to say that.
I think it's important that incarcerated individuals are heard, because in here they have a drug program, TC, Therapeutic Community. A lot of the guys who are placed in this, who are given this as a prescriptive program when they get classified, a lot of guys have drug issues. And whether it's in prison or in the street, NA, AA, a lot of people who have drug issues, they don't want to hear somebody stand up and talk to them that's never used drugs. And at Alcoholics Anonymous, they don't want to hear from someone that's saying, don't drink, but you never had an alcohol problem. So you won't ever know what's important as far as measuring success, stopping recidivism, putting a limit on how you measure recidivism, unless you talk to individuals that's incarcerated. Right. Look, you know, like Eric said, we look at you. No doubt. If you had a conversation prior to release and now, I'm pretty sure it would be up here as an example. That's why I think it's important.
So, what are some of the supports that you're going to need to support you in making those intrinsic decisions that will help you achieve the type of success that you want to achieve?
One is, like I spoke of, is getting with men who've already been out there, walk the walk, and can look me in my eye when I'm lying to them about situations because they know, they've been there. Another thing I was thinking about is that a parole or probation officer who is, it's their job to assist me and genuinely want the best for me. Another thing is places where we can go and talk, because I just think that now a lot of us are walking around and we're just wearing masks. We have to adapt. There's nothing I can do. I'm here, and I'm here for my period of time. But a lot of us are in pain, we struggle, and it's sad to say, I think most of the time we take it out on each other and don't even really realize it. But I think that there needs to be places out there where we can go and talk, where these people know and they could tap into those inner things that need to be talked about and brought out, and hopefully handled.
Before my release, I said I want to make decisions that are likely different than some of the people who preceded me in their release. So oftentimes people get out, we know the first thing that they want to do, some people want to have a drink, or they want to have a smoke, or they want to get with their partner, right? Because they've been inside for such a certain amount of time. And I was saying I want to not do any of those things, put myself in a situation where I want to be disciplined enough to make decisions that I'm not rushing into a relationship. I'm not trying to do these other things that we know put us at risk.
I'm no stranger to this. I was incarcerated one time before, and it was so short of a time, clearly I didn't get it. There's no more going to hang with the same people. And in my situation, I've been going so long, the same people no longer living. I never want to be put in a situation where I'm back here. Never.
I want to say thank you for allowing us to be here to talk to you all. And what are some closing reflections?
I think we need to have more conversations like this, honestly. As the questions were asked earlier, and as I listened to you all talk, one of the things, if you're not at the table, I've heard it said you end up on the menu. Mm-hmm. But keeping it real, have some real conversations, and I think we can have, again, people reach the fullness of their life. I don't see it as an either or. Really, it's about being the best that you can be, and that's all you can do today. I'd like to think that we're all better people than we were then, and hopefully we'll get better as life goes on. So I think keep on having conversations, both around the data, both around the research, but just about life in a real sort of way.
And Mr. Little, I just appreciate that, how you spoke, you included yourself, with us, and that made the conversation at the table, real. But I think we too, without the cameras or the mics, need to continue to have these conversations, how we can help one another, be a part of that 38%.
Becoming better than you've been before, and I think that's really important, and I'm just grateful for being here. So thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Little, and you gentlemen for just allowing us to come in today. As a child of a formerly incarcerated parent, these conversations definitely need to be had so that people can help to restore their families, get stabilized once they're home, and create the communities they want to see as living examples. So I just wanted to say thank you again.
Thank you.
And we're going to let you have the last word, Secretary.
The last word simply is thank you, and I wish everyone here the absolute best.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. So what we want to do now is go to a question and answer phase. I do want to say that after that segment, the question and answer, we're going to have a facilitated discussion with people here at Eastern. It's happening at Fortune, it's happening at SCI Chester, and it's happening at other places around the country. I'll talk to some colleagues in Texas, some colleagues in DC and in Georgia. So we're really excited for that. We wanted to do something slightly different, which is to have these conversations so that we can gather the thoughts and reflections of folks who are in the room after the live stream ends, and have someone take notes so that we can also share that information with the National Academies, with Fortune, and with others, because some of you obviously weren't consulted when we worked on the report. So we do want to hear from you. We know that many of you have ideas that could contribute to this particular conversation. So I want to turn to some questions that we received from the folks who are joining via Zoom. We have, I think Carla said, over 300 and something people, Carla, who joined. Okay, I see a thumb up in the back. So one of the questions that came up, direct this one towards Nancy, and is asking about something that we talked a little bit about, which is can we also address better measures for federal grants, SAMHSA, DOJ, et cetera, and should the measurement of recidivism be a part of those particular grants? And just what are your thoughts about that?
I want to make sure I understand the question correctly. So should federal grants be asking about performance metrics that are related to recidivism, which, as I understand, and Deanna, you probably know this better than I do based on your role at heading up the Second Chance Act, right? That whole, and I think that traditionally that is requested. And the question is, what should be requested? I think some of that is actually codified in the Second Chance Act as a requirement. But I imagine there's much more we can do at the federal level to expand that definition to include the types of measures of success that the National Academies report discusses.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's also, this question seems to talk about when you see a lot of those grants, they're asking different programs to reduce recidivism among the population that are being served in particular, and we know how much of a struggle that is for a program in particular, whether it be a health program or a social services program, to try to reduce recidivism based upon the limitations. So, you want to take a hit at that particular question as well?
I'll kind of follow up on that. I think there's, as I stated before, there's no clear definition of recidivism. And in society, each state, jurisdiction, and locality operates different. I think even going back to the example you talked about with a young man running a stop sign and actually getting a technical violation, and I learned this personally, that the burden of proof for a violation does not have to be as onus in a violation as it does in a criminal court. It was just simply the fact that he came into contact with law enforcement allowed that technical violation to go on. So if you're saying a rearrest or a reincarceration within 3 years, and that was a technical violation, he ran a stoplight, he wasn't found guilty of anything, that actually is increasing the number. And I think also, without the clear definition, and this most people don't know, is that you have systems that don't talk to each other. So I go through the court system, I get sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Child support doesn't know how to find me because the prison system didn't tell them I was incarcerated. So now I have an outstanding warrant that's been on the books for 8 years while I serve an 8-year sentence. Upon my release, I'm immediately either rearrested back to that county for that outstanding child support warrant that actually simply because the system did not communicate. But am I a recidivist? Did I commit a new crime? So I always say that the federal government, as the leader, as pushing the way, we have to determine what recidivism is. Is it committing a new crime within that 3 years of release? But is it a new crime that is actually a higher level than the crime I was originally sentenced on? Because all of that plays a role too. One of the things we tried to do at BJA is we don't count collateral benefits or collateral success. If I came into your program once I was released from prison and I was homeless, and although I may have been rearrested for something, did I obtain housing? Was I better off in any way when you interacted with me? Because that's the return on investment of the federal dollars to say we're trying to help people be successful. So actually not counting those type of benefits is actually limiting, again, what we're really investing in as taxpayers in this country. Are we investing in systems that are moving people to a higher level of success, especially when we know people who enter prison, typically a lot of them are already homeless. So I enter prison homeless, I had 3 hots and a cot, I get released, I'm still homeless. So even did incarceration serve me in any kind of way if you didn't connect me to the community of actually being successful? And Stan said it, we have to stop focusing on the mass, the numbers, and focus on the incarceration, that we see the human dignity in people and move people from surviving to thriving, because the majority of us enter prison in a survival mode. How do we move to a thriving mode?
You know, I'll add to this. I mean, I'd say different than Dr. Levine. I can just stand out as a person that has like National Institutes of Health funding and has focused on different sorts of studies looking at the health of people that have been incarcerated and different health outcomes. And one of them is right now a study looking on people with opioid use disorder. And so many of the measures that we have at the individual level, especially when you look at kind of how a person does over time with opioid use disorder, are ones of relapse, if they've used, and they're also really flat. You know, like they just look at a person, a single measure of time, don't really understand how a person has changed over time and how that pattern has changed. But within medicine, within kind of measures of opioid use disorder, we do look at that, the relapse, as Secretary Little said, how it does change over time. They're not perfect measures. They're still kind of flat, but they're more encompassing of the experience. And within those measures, we often have to, because they're embedded within measures, look at arrest, look at kind of new crimes. We have to capture those within the National Institutes of Health. And I personally think that they're almost impossible to interpret at the individual level because of the social context. You know, if you're a person, as Secretary Little was saying, a black man living in a community is arrested at higher rates, you know, what does it mean at the individual level? If you're understanding that there isn't opioid use disorder treatment programs in the community, what does it mean that you have been arrested and once you get into jail, you don't have that treatment? I mean, so the arrest variable, I think, is pretty much meaningless in my opinion, and I think I'm hoping that this report will push researchers and policymakers to really rethink how it is that we measure success, and especially these measures of recidivism that are not clearly defined, not consistently defined, and not encompassing of the whole person's experience post-release. So I'd say no, get rid of it.
Gotcha. Question for you, Secretary Little. It says, can we suspend the use of reentry? Correctional facilities need to be seen as part of the communities, so that it's not those people, but our families and neighborhoods. And I think that that's an interesting, idea. What are your thoughts about having correctional facilities be viewed differently than they currently are?
I absolutely think that we should move to that. Mention was made of the Norwegian experience. We are currently running a pilot at SCI Chester, which we call Little Scandinavia. And it really is about taking a different look at it. When we went and visited the Swedish correctional services, we saw something that was very unlike what we have here in the United States, and yet we saw many things that were alike. And so with that, we need to have that inclusion of family. If you look at the data clearly shows that criminal justice involvement isn't about an individual. Oftentimes it's about families. And so we want to have that kind of impact. We should go ahead and do that. But it's kind of like some of the debates around policing. I mean, corrections can't be all things. And so I think fundamentally we have to shift from a philosophy that leads us to recidivism that's based on retribution and incapacitation to one that's more about restoration and reconciliation. And if we can move to that, then I think we can engage not only the whole person, but the whole family.
Thank you.
Oh, can I just
Yeah,
add
of
something?
course.
It's one of the barriers to thinking about the correctional environment being part of the community is that often the people who are housed in a prison are so far away from home. And that's been a perennial problem that I know that some jurisdictions have done better about, or perhaps maybe transferring someone closer to home for the last 6 months. But if you're really going to make communities out of places, you need to think about the role that place plays in that, right? And it speaks to location and proximity, but it also speaks to duration of incarceration.
If I may just jump in real quick, one good thing that came out of COVID for us was the use of video visitation. And heretofore, I mean, you had to make that trip all across the Commonwealth. Most of our commitments in Pennsylvania come out of the Philadelphia area. And if we look at where our institutions are located, they're not located for family connection. They're located, I mean, just candidly for economic development purposes, right? And where you could find the space. And so video visitation has allowed a level of contact, and I think we really have to explore, and we're trying to explore, how can we more effectively use at least that virtual piece in very intentional sorts of ways. So it's about making the best of the hand that we're dealt.
Can I just do a follow-up there? Because I think this is where we get into that kind of catch-22, right? Where prisons are totally in isolated rural areas, they become the economic viability in those areas that wouldn't have had anything. Traditionally, you have family history of legacy working at the prison. But then director said something that was very positive. COVID did something positive around video visitation. But as formerly incarcerated, there's nothing that can replace the human touch of my family, right? Then now we're getting into the prison profiteering who are making money off of those video visitations. So it's just this big vicious cycle of, let's be honest, prison is a thriving business for prison profiteering, where there's the video, the commissary, the beds, the buildings, but it's also an economic viability in certain communities that wouldn't have that. And then how do we actually keep family units together, because there's nothing that can replace me hugging my son when he comes to visit me. A video's not going to give him that cure, you know. And video visitations are typically 15 minutes, half an hour, whereas sometimes a prison visit can almost be 4 to 5 hours sometimes. So it's always this catch-22 that I don't think we've really started to process out, because it is a huge issue. So how do we do little bitty micro things like a little Scandinavian, or looking at things in that nature, because this is a very complex issue that we have to take a bite out of, but I think we have to keep biting and bringing those other partners together too.
Yeah. We have a couple of minutes left before we shift to the facilitated discussion, so I want to try to get some closing remarks from folks. One of the things that I was asked if we could provide maybe a short answer to this is, you know, kind of shifting the conversation away from the individual and towards the system. And as a person who was in the system, I know that, of course, we have to think more broadly about the system, but individuals also have a responsibility. You know, when I come home, I have a responsibility, right? If I, like I did before, engage in certain behaviors that deprecate my community, then I'm responsible for that. And I don't want to be in a situation, and I don't want us to be in a situation where we only blame the system. The system has to be accountable, but we as individuals have to be accountable too. And so I just want to get some reflections from each of you on that particular question before we close out. Start with you, Secretary Little, and come in this way.
So I understand that there may be individual and social predicates to everything, but at the end of the day, I'll speak from my own experience. It's about choices, right? And so we have to be honest with ourselves. And you heard, I believe it was Eric talking about that, when we're sort of lying to ourselves. So ultimately, though, we want to create the opportunities for people to make meaningful, positive choices, right? And so that's the best that we can do. And that, to me, is really, when we start talking about recidivism, is equipping people and creating those opportunities to make positive choices. And then it still comes back to the individual and whatever she or he may decide to do in those circumstances. Glad to be a part of this conversation, and as I said before, we need to continue this.
I kind of chuckled when you said that around individuals, and I thought about my best friend who said one time she was released, and she was released back to the street, and she was back within 14 days, and she just told everybody she went to solitary confinement, right? Because she didn't understand what she had triggered so immediately when she was released in that survival mode. But I think it's just like we talked about, this isn't a one-way conversation. Once individuals make a decision not to participate in criminal activity or different things, I can always fight the system. But I first have to make a decision within myself that I'm not going to do what kept having me break out in what I call stainless steel bracelets, right? I'm not willing to keep repeating that behavior. And for me, it was substance abuse misuse. But how do I change it? So again, not blaming anyone. This is a broad conversation, but the individuals who are currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, we first have to make the personal decision that this isn't something I'm going to participate in, because all the barriers society and the system put up, I can actually fight. And that's why we're sitting at this table, because just leadership, we say those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but typically furthest from resource and power to do something about it. But that's why we're sitting at this table, because we're taking back our power and we're actually having access to the resources to change it.
Emily?
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. It's one that I feel like I often have in clinic where, you know, at the end of the day, it is, of course, about that person, the father, the, you know, wife that's come home, that's really grappling kind of with the individual decisions they make. And also when choices are really constricted, I mean, I think that that's the kind of what I've seen over and over now over a decade. And it's hard to kind of have, you know, an honest conversation in this space to say that, of course, it's about the individual choice and personhood and not stripping that. And also, our conversations rarely kind of go to what it is that the systems and structures and the laws that exist, not just for now, but over, you know, centuries. And so to me, I think that that's the space that we're in now, is to really revision and reimagine kind of how it is that we measure success, and moving beyond from the individual level more to kind of how it is that structures are and should be accountable. That's what excites me.
Thank you, Emily. Lauren?
I think individually, as employers, providing somebody a job opportunity can transform their life. And so I think it's really on employers to make those individual decisions, to give people jobs, to learn about, and even go into prisons to do their recruiting, so that they can change the narrative, right, of employment out here. The other thing I'm thinking about is that individual education is how we change systems. And so that's really the power that we have here at Eastern State, is that we educate the public about the past and present of incarceration so that we can create a better present and future together.
Nancy?
So when you go last, you have a choice of trying to find something new that hasn't already been said by very distinguished panelists, or repeating what they said and sounding smart because of it. But I think I'm going to choose the former and answer the question in a little bit different way. I mean, without a doubt, individuals have to make decisions whether they want to take certain actions or not. But that's a little tough to put on anyone. It suggests that there's not all these factors at play, including, even the experience of being around people who model making good decisions, right? And so I think it's just very complicated. I know why you asked the question. I don't like it because it suggests that, like, we're all just individual decision makers that aren't affected by the people around us, the context, and what we've experienced. So I will close by making a point that I was unable to make earlier, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the context about what we know from research. And, I've spent a couple decades getting pretty well versed in everything about what makes for a successful reentry program, right? And lots of research looking at, the impact of various programs on people's behaviors. recidivism, but other behaviors as well. But I can't think of one research study that's taken the time to look at the prison climate and how that affects people's experiences with programs. And what I would argue is you could have the best program in the world on paper. It could be implemented with the most fidelity ever. But if I'm a program participant and I don't have my basic human needs met, and first and foremost, feeling safe, maybe, being able to get enough calories in my body, being cold, not having all my healthcare needs met, I'm not going to bring my best self to any program, and I'm probably not going to benefit from it. But nobody's looking at that context, and I think it's all important.
Thank you. And we started a couple of minutes late. It's already noon, so we do want to give our colleagues in Harlem an opportunity to offer some closing reflections as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Michaela so that we can hear from Jeremy and Stan.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ronald. As I reflect on that question, two things, right? One, there is an individual accountability. I think about my own journey and the harm I caused my community, and I accept that responsibility and work every day to make my community and this city and this nation a better nation by really centering our work on the humanity that binds us all. The second thing is that we cannot, and I say we cannot forget that we are up facing a system that has chosen to disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, that we have chosen as a nation to invest in building prisons and incarcerating people and punishing people. We have strategically invested in the things that weaken communities as opposed to strengthen communities. And while I take personal responsibility for the harm that I caused to my community, I think as a nation, we have to reconcile with the fact that we have invested in taking Black and brown people out of their community, engaging in perpetual and collateral consequences when it comes to people with convictions, and we have not adequately resourced those communities. We talk about community safety as if it is a thing and not an experience that communities have. And we talk about it as if the answer is an investment in punishment, as opposed to an investment in the health, well-being, and stability of our communities. And so while I take personal responsibility for what I have done, and I think there is an individual element to it, yes, but there is a national reconciliation we need to do with the fact that we have invested in mass incarceration that has caused generational harms and has not made our communities safer, healthier, or more sustainable.
At the end of the day, what I think we're talking about today is a political project. And the political project is for people in this room and on this Zoom conference and others, many others, to say to people who are in positions of responsibility, whether elected or appointed, to change course dramatically. So when we talk about the mass incarceration, which was a great question, Michaela, and we want to set ourselves the goal of ending mass incarceration, we can't do that by lots of good programs. We can't do that by simply sort of wonderful places like Fortune Society. We have to do that by getting our elected officials to change course in terms of how we think about the punishment project of America, particularly over the last half century. So we are here because we chose to be here. Maybe people in this room didn't choose to be here, but we as a democracy chose this state of affairs. So all of the structural and political and policy barriers that we've talked about that get in the way of the human agency that Ronald wants us to focus on appropriately, those barriers are by a political choice. So the political project that we should commit to is to elect people who undo that, who say there's got to be a better way. We know there's a better way, but we have to commit ourselves to that better way. It's going to take time. It took us 50 years to get here. It's going to take us hopefully less than that to get out of here. I applaud the reduction I'm a New Yorker. I love the fact that we have fewer people in prison and jail. That's great. But we really need to do something very different. And that starts with short sentences. Why do we have young people in prison for life? How do we sort of imagine that as a life, right? So we have to think about our what Bruce and Wes and I call punitive excess. The era of punitive excess has to come to an end, and it comes to an end by doing what Stanley was talking about, which is confronting our own history. And that's a project of reckoning with the racial dynamics of punishment in America, confronting it squarely, and then holding our government accountable for undoing the damage so that we have a very different future. So if we talk about reentry and we have far fewer people coming out of prison, that's the good day. If we talk about prisons, we have far fewer people in prison to meet inhumane conditions, that's a good day. So we have to just reverse course. Then desistance is not so much a question of coming out of prison, because fewer people are in prison coming out of prison. We're talking about people's lives, right? In communities where people are thriving. So at the end of the day, this is a political project, and that's what we should commit to.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Stan. So we're going to end this segment, the live stream part, and start the facilitated dialogue. And I want to say to our colleagues, Jeff and Marie and Val, who are in SCI Chester, we appreciate you facilitating that conversation with the men in that facility. And we want to, as Secretary Little said, continue the conversation and invite other departments to be involved in this. So we're going to be pushing for that. And so thank you all, to all of you who have joined this conversation. Thank you to our esteemed panelists who've taken out your time from this busy day. Some of you coming from distances to be here with us. We really, really appreciate it. And we're ready to get into the facilitated discussion and to get your feedback and to share it. And please fill out or complete the post survey so that we can get some feedback from you on that. And then also share questions with us, and we'll try to get those questions answered at some point. Thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate it. A round of applause to our panelists, please, and to everyone that has joined.